It was late afternoon, that quiet time before Christmas when the house feels heavier than usual, when even the walls seem to wait for something, and I was sitting at my table wrapping gifts I wasn't even sure I would get to give, sigh. Folding paper carefully like if I did it right enough maybe things would feel right too, ha ha ha, silly thought, when my phone buzzed softly against the wood, not a call, just a message. And for some reason my heart still jumped like it always did when his name appeared, because no matter how old your child gets, some part of you never stops hoping. I picked up the phone, glanced at the screen, and there it was, short. Plain cold, no hello, no explanation, just words sitting there like they had been waiting to hurt me. Don't come to our house for Christmas. My wife is against you. Please respect our decision. I remember reading it once, then again, slower the second time, as if I had misunderstood the first. As if the words might rearrange themselves into something kinder if I gave them time, sigh. But they didn't. They stayed exactly where they were, sharp and final, and for a moment my chest felt tight. Like someone had gently but firmly placed a hand there and wasn't moving it away. Christmas of all days, the one day that had always belonged to family, to tradition, to togetherness. And suddenly I was on the outside, looking in, not invited. Not wanted, not even discussed, just informed, and what hurt the most wasn't even the message itself. It was how easily it had been sent, how quickly a lifetime of memories could be pushed aside with a few taps of a finger. I sat there staring at the screen, my eyes stinging, my throat thick. And yes, I cried a little. I won't pretend I didn't. A quiet cry, the kind where tears roll down without sound, because at my age you don't sob. You just leak pain slowly. But then something strange happened, something I didn't expect even from myself. The tears stopped, my breathing steadied, and I felt this odd calm settle in, not peace exactly, but clarity. The kind that comes when something inside you finally clicks into place. I read the message a third time, and this time I smiled, actually smiled, not because it was funny, no, it wasn't funny at all. But because in that moment I realized something my son clearly had not, and that realization changed everything, I leaned back in my chair, phone still in my hand, and whispered to myself, "Oh, you have no idea, ha ha ha, because you see. When he wrote Our House, he believed it, truly believed it, and why wouldn't he? They'd lived there for years, made changes, filled it with their life, their furniture, their routines. And somewhere along the way, he had forgotten one very important detail, or maybe he'd never really understood it to begin with. And as I sat there in the quiet of my own home, the irony of it all washed over me so hard I had to close my eyes for a second. This wasn't just a message telling me not to come for Christmas. This was a line drawn in the sand, a decision made without me, about something that was never truly theirs to decide. And that's when the smile stayed, not wide, not cruel, just small and steady. Because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. I stood up slowly, my knees protesting like they always do, walked to the window and looked outside at the fading light, thinking about how strange life is, how one sentence can carry so much history, so much sacrifice, so much unspoken truth behind it. I thought about the years that led to this moment, the choices I had made out of love, out of trust, out of the belief that family means you give without keeping score, and I felt a soft laugh escape me. Not happy, not sad, just amazed at how blind love can make you. If this story already feels familiar to you, if you've ever felt pushed aside by someone you gave everything to, stay with me. And if you want to hear how moments like this truly unfold, subscribe, because some stories don't end where you think they will. I went back to the table, set the phone down carefully, like it was something fragile, and without rushing. Without anger, without even replying right away, I poured myself a cup of tea, steam rising gently, my hands surprisingly steady, because whatever my son thought he had decided with that message, whatever power he believed he was holding, he had no idea what he had just started. And as the clock ticked forward toward evening, I knew one thing for certain: by the time the sun went down, this Christmas would already look very different than he imagined. And the knock that was coming would not be on my heart, but on my door. Before anyone judges what I did next, I need you to understand who I was long before that message ever arrived, because people love to look at the final moment and forget the lifetime that built it, sigh. And my life didn't begin in comfort or certainty. It began with arrival, with fear, with carrying 2 suitcases and a child's hand into a country that didn't know my name and didn't care to learn it. I still remember that first winter. The way the cold felt sharper than anything I had known, the way I counted coins at the grocery store, pretending I wasn't scared while my son looked up at me with complete trust, as if I had all the answers. Ha ha ha, imagine that. A woman with no savings, broken English, and a child depending on her, somehow convincing him everything would be fine. I worked 2 jobs back then, sometimes 3, mornings cleaning offices, afternoons at a small store, nights sewing or taking extra shifts whenever someone didn't show up. I learned how to smile when my feet hurt, how to nod when customers spoke too fast, how to cry silently on buses so no one would ask questions. And through all of it, my son grew strong, smart, kind, or so I believed. I packed his lunches, helped with homework at the kitchen table, fell asleep reading school notes, woke up again before dawn, years blurred together that way. Sacrifice turning into routine, routine turning into identity, and somewhere along the line, I stopped thinking of myself as a person with wants and started thinking of myself as a foundation, something others stand on without noticing. But I didn't resent it, not then. Love makes you generous. Love makes you blind. Love convinces you that if you give enough, it will come back to you naturally. And when my son grew older, graduated, got his first real job, I felt proud in a quiet way, not loud, not boastful, just that warm feeling that says, I did my part. When he met his wife, I welcomed her with that same open heart. I cooked more, smiled more, tried harder. Because that's what mothers like me do. We adjust, we bend, we make space. And when they talked about buying a house, about building a future, I didn't hesitate the way I probably should have. They were young, credit not strong yet. Prices rising, stress everywhere, and I thought, why not help? Why not make their life easier than mine had been? So I did what I had always done. I stepped in quietly. I put down the money, signed the papers in my name temporarily. Told myself it was just a formality, just until they got settled, just until things stabilized. Family doesn't need contracts, right? Ha ha ha. That's what I told myself. Family doesn't keep receipts, and for a while it felt right. They were grateful, affectionate, called often, invited me over, and I let myself believe this was the reward part of life, the gentle chapter after all the hard ones. But generosity has a strange side effect. Give too much without boundaries, and people stop seeing it as a gift. They start seeing it as the way things are supposed to be. They forget there was ever a choice, and slowly, without me noticing at first, the balance shifted. The help became expected, the gratitude became normal, the respect optional. I didn't wake up one day and realize I was being pushed aside. It happened the way erosion happens, quietly over time, a missed call here, a canceled visit there, little things you explain away because you don't want to be that mother, the one who complains, the one who causes tension, sigh, so you swallow it. You tell yourself love means patience, love means stepping back. Love means letting your child build their own life, even if it means you become a smaller part of it. But deep down, something felt wrong, not dramatic wrong, just off, like a chair that looks fine until you sit on it and it wobbles. And yet, even then, I didn't regret helping them. Not once, because in my mind, I wasn't buying loyalty or control. I was investing in family, in shared future, in the belief that kindness plants seeds. But seeds don't always grow the way you expect. Sometimes they grow entitlement, sometimes they grow distance, and sometimes they grow the idea that the person who gave you everything can also be told to stay away without consequence. If you're listening to this and thinking, I've done that too, I've given without asking, then you understand how dangerous love without limits can be, and if stories like this make you pause and reflect on your own life. Stay with me and subscribe, because this isn't just my story, it's a pattern many of us recognize too late. When that message arrived, it wasn't just a Christmas rejection, it was the final proof that somewhere along the way, my sacrifices had been rewritten as obligations, my generosity as weakness, and my presence as inconvenience. And that realization hurt more than any insult ever could, because it meant I had raised my son to stand tall, but forgotten to teach him where he came from. And as I sat there that evening, tea cooling in my cup, memories stacking one on top of another, I understood something else as well. Every choice I had made out of love had led us here. And now it was time to make one not out of love alone, but out of self-respect, because the truth about that house and the truth about me were about to collide in a way my son never saw coming, and when they did, nothing between us would ever be the same again. Looking back now, I can see the exact moment things began to change, but at the time it felt so small, so harmless, that I brushed it aside with a tired smile and a sigh, because that's what mothers like me do. We excuse first and question later. It started with the phone calls, nothing dramatic, just a shift. Sundays used to belong to us. His voice warm and relaxed, telling me about his week, asking what I cooked, laughing at small things, ha ha ha. Then suddenly Sundays became busy. Then calls came every other week, then once a month, always rushed, always short, like he was checking something off a list. And when I suggested visiting, there was always a reason ready. The house was messy. They already had plans. She wasn't feeling well, maybe next time. And I told myself this was normal. Young couples need space. Mothers must learn to step back. I repeated that sentence so many times it almost felt true. But then the tone changed too. His voice became careful, measured, like someone else might be listening. And sometimes when I called, it wasn't even him who answered, it was her, cheerful on the surface but clipped underneath. He's busy, she'd say. I'll tell him you called, and the call would end, and the call back never came. I remember sitting on my couch afterward, phone still in my hand, staring at nothing. Wondering when talking to your own child started to feel like interrupting someone else's life, I began noticing the little comments too, the ones disguised as jokes. The kind that make everyone laugh while you sit there feeling strangely small, remarks about how I raised him, about how he never learned certain habits, about how things are done differently now. Each one light enough to deny if questioned, heavy enough to sting if felt, and my son who once stood up for me against anyone, said nothing, not a word, not even a glance in my direction. He'd just smile awkwardly and change the subject, and that silence hurt more than the comments ever could, because silence is agreement dressed as peace. I tried once gently to mention it, just a soft question. Did I do something wrong? And he laughed nervously, waved it away, told me I was imagining things, that everyone was stressed, that I shouldn't overthink, and I wanted to believe him, so I did. Because believing him was easier than accepting the truth, which was that I was slowly being edited out of his life, one polite excuse at a time. I remember one afternoon clearly. I had found a box of old photos while cleaning. Pictures of him as a child, missing teeth, messy hair, proud school projects, and I thought this will make him smile. I didn't call ahead. I wanted it to be a surprise. Through the window, I saw them laughing together, relaxed, close. Her hand resting on his arm, and my heart softened for a second. This is good, I thought. He's happy. But the moment she noticed my car, everything changed. Her face tightened. She leaned in and whispered something to him. And I watched his expression shift like a switch flipped. When the door opened, the warmth was gone, replaced with that polite stiffness people use with strangers. "We weren't expecting you," she said, not unkindly, but not kindly either. And when I tried to hand him the photos, she cut in, telling me about boundaries, about needing notice, about how I can't just show up. And that word, boundaries, landed like a slap. Because when did a mother need permission to bring memories to her own child? I left shortly after, smiling, apologizing, even though my chest felt hollow. And in the car, I sat there for a long time before turning the key, breathing slowly. Telling myself I was being dramatic, that this was just a phase, sigh, but deep down, something knew this wasn't temporary, this was deliberate, because distance doesn't just happen, it's created. And the more I tried to shrink myself to fit into their lives, the more invisible I became. Holidays grew tense, invitations felt forced, conversations stayed shallow, and I found myself editing my words before speaking. Choosing silence over risk because saying the wrong thing might cost me even more access. That's the quiet cruelty of this kind of exclusion. It doesn't scream, it whispers. It convinces you to blame yourself, to doubt your worth, to accept less just to stay included. And yet, even then, I didn't push back. I didn't demand explanations. I didn't assert myself because I was afraid of being labeled difficult, afraid of losing him completely. Afraid that love required me to endure discomfort quietly. But what I didn't realize was that by staying silent, I was teaching them something dangerous, that my feelings were optional, that my presence was negotiable, that I could be moved aside without consequence, and that lesson settled in deeper than any argument ever could, if you've ever felt this slow fading. This gentle erasing where no one ever says go away, but somehow you end up alone anyway. You know how confusing it is, how lonely it feels, how you start questioning your own memories, your own value. And if this story is touching something inside you, stay with me, because what came next wasn't loud or angry. It was calm, precise, and final. And when the moment arrived where I could no longer pretend this was misunderstanding, when silence turned into rejection, I didn't break the way they expected me to. Instead, I finally stopped shrinking. And that decision, the one I made quietly, would change everything that followed in ways my son never imagined. Thanksgiving was the moment I could no longer lie to myself, the moment where everything I had been excusing suddenly stood right in front of me, undeniable sigh. Because holidays have a way of revealing truths people hide the rest of the year, I remember standing at their door that evening, holding a pie I had made from scratch, the same one my son used to beg for when he was little. The one he called the good one, ha ha ha, and when the door opened, her smile was there, but it didn't reach her eyes, it never did anymore. "Oh, you're here," she said, not surprised exactly, just inconvenienced. As if my presence was an extra chair she hadn't planned for, I stepped inside, the house warm, decorated, smelling like food and comfort. And for a brief second I felt foolish for worrying. Maybe I had imagined everything. Maybe tonight would be different, but it didn't take long for that hope to fade. Dinner was polite on the surface, forks clinking, glasses filling, conversation moving carefully around safe topics. And then the comments started, light, smiling. Wrapped in laughter so no one could accuse her of being rude. Remarks about how my son never learned to clean properly, about how some habits come from childhood, about how she had to teach him basic things. And each time she laughed after, expecting everyone else to laugh too, and they did softly, awkwardly except me. I sat there feeling my face warm, my hands tighten around my fork, my chest sink a little lower with every sentence. And I waited for my son to say something, anything, a small defense, a joke to shift blame away from me. A simple "that's not fair." But he didn't. He stared at his plate, nodded along, changed the subject, and in that silence, something inside me cracked, not loudly, not visibly, just a quiet fracture. Ah, because when the person you protected your whole life won't protect you in return, the pain is different. It's heavier, more personal. I smiled through it. Of course I did, made myself small, excused myself to the kitchen to help, because that's what I knew how to do. But standing there by the sink, hands in soapy water, listening to their voices behind me, I felt tears gather. And I swallowed them back, telling myself I was being too sensitive, that this wasn't worth ruining a holiday over, that peace mattered more than pride. But peace built on humiliation is fragile, and it doesn't last. The drive home that night was quiet, the roads empty, the radio low, and when I pulled into my driveway, I didn't go inside right away. I just sat there in the dark, hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly, and then, for the first time in many years, I cried the way I hadn't allowed myself to cry before, deep, shaking, silent sobs that left my chest aching. Not because of what she had said, but because of what he hadn't. Because I realized I was grieving someone who was still alive, the son I used to know, the one who would have never let anyone speak about me that way, the one who once told me, "Mom, I've got you," and now here I was. Feeling like a guest in a life I had helped build, I told myself that night that it was just a bad evening, just stress, just misunderstandings piling up, but the truth was already there. Staring at me through my own reflection in the windshield, I was no longer seen as family. I was tolerated, managed, minimized, and that realization hurt more than being openly rejected ever could, because rejection is clear. But this was slow erosion, polite exclusion, the kind that makes you doubt yourself. And yet, even after that night, even after the tears dried and my chest felt hollow, I still didn't confront them, I still didn't demand respect. Because part of me hoped things would fix themselves, that my son would wake up one morning and remember who I was to him. But hope without action is just waiting, and waiting had already cost me too much. If you've ever sat in your car after a family gathering feeling smaller than when you arrived, if you've ever cried not because someone was cruel, but because someone you loved let it happen, then you know exactly what I felt that night. And if this story feels uncomfortably familiar, stay with me, because that Thanksgiving wasn't the worst moment. It was the warning, the final quiet sign before the storm. And when Christmas came and the message arrived telling me not to come at all, I wasn't shocked anymore. I was ready, even if I didn't yet know how far that readiness would take me, or how quickly everything was about to change. By the time Christmas came around, I already felt tired in a way sleep doesn't fix, that deep kind of exhaustion that comes from holding yourself together for too long, sigh, and when I finally gathered the courage to ask about plans. I did it carefully, softly, like walking on thin ice, because I had learned that even curiosity could be taken the wrong way. The phone rang once, twice, then her voice answered, not his, hers, calm and flat, as if she had been expecting me. And before I could even finish my sentence, she said it. We're doing our own thing this year. No hesitation, no warmth, just a statement. And when I reminded her that Christmas had always been ours, that we always spent it together. There was a pause, not thoughtful, not conflicted, just cold, and then she said, things change, and the line went dead. I sat there staring at the phone, listening to the silence buzz in my ear, and that night I cried again, not loudly. Just enough to let the pain escape, because at 63 years old, after surviving poverty, illness, loss, and starting over more than once, I never imagined that the thing that would bring me to tears would be being uninvited from my own child's Christmas. But even then, even after that call, I still bought the gifts. I wrapped them carefully, chose things I knew he'd like. Because hope is stubborn, hope makes you believe that love might still win at the last moment, ha ha ha. And then came the day before Christmas. The 23rd, quiet gray, the kind of day where time seems to slow down. I was sitting at the table, paper scraps around me, ribbon curled neatly, when my phone buzzed, and for a split second, my heart lifted, foolishly thinking maybe this was it. Maybe he had changed his mind. Maybe he was calling to say sorry. I opened the message, and there it was, written plainly, without apology. Don't come to our house for Christmas. My wife is against you. Respect our decision. I read it once, then again, slower, like maybe I had misunderstood. But no, the words stayed exactly where they were, sharp and final, and something inside me gave way, but not the way it had before. This time it didn't shatter, it settled, clear and cold. I noticed how he didn't say, we decided. He said, my wife, as if passing responsibility made it easier, as if that softened the blow, and the phrase, our house, stood out to me. Glowing almost, because I knew something he had either forgotten or chosen to ignore, and that knowledge changed the way the message landed. My hands stopped shaking, my breathing slowed, and instead of crying, I laughed softly under my breath. Not because it was funny, but because the irony was almost too much to bear. Sigh, all those years of sacrifice, all that patience, all that shrinking. And here I was being told to stay away from something I had built with my own hands and savings, something I had given out of love, believing family meant trust. I set the phone down, stared at the wall for a long moment, and realized this wasn't just rejection, this was erasure, an attempt to rewrite reality where I was no longer part of the picture. And for the first time, I didn't rush to explain, didn't try to fix, didn't send a long emotional reply. I simply smiled quietly because something had shifted. The fear I had been carrying for months, the fear of losing my son if I stood up for myself, suddenly felt smaller than the fear of losing myself if I didn't. And if you've ever been at that crossroads where staying silent feels safer but also emptier, then you understand exactly what was happening inside me. And if stories like this resonate with you, if they make you feel seen or understood, subscribe and stay with me because sometimes hearing someone else's truth gives you permission to face your own. I picked up my phone again, not to argue, not to plead, but to respond calmly, deliberately. My fingers steady as I typed just a few simple sentences. Nothing dramatic, nothing emotional, just facts. And when I pressed send, I felt a strange sense of peace wash over me, like I had finally stepped back into my own skin. I didn't know how he would react. I didn't know how fast things would move after that. But I knew one thing for sure, whatever happened next, I would no longer be begging for space in a life I helped create. And as the afternoon faded into evening, as the light outside softened and the clock moved forward, I had no idea that in less than an hour, my quiet house would no longer be quiet. That the message I sent would send my son into a panic he wasn't prepared for, or that the next sound I would hear would change the balance between us forever, because the knock that was coming wasn't a request. It was the sound of reality catching up, and it was closer than he realized. I didn't rush when I heard the car, the sharp sound of tires outside my house cutting through the quiet like a sudden confession. I actually smiled again, softer this time, because something told me exactly who it was before I even looked. Sigh, and sure enough, through the window I saw him step out, movements fast, uneven, the confidence he usually carried replaced by something frantic, almost boyish. He walked up the path like someone who had forgotten where he was going but knew he had to get there fast. And when the knocking started, it wasn't polite, it wasn't patient, it was urgent, desperate. The kind of knocking that asks forgiveness before words ever do. Mom, he called, his voice cracking through the door. Mom, please open. And I stood there for a moment, not out of cruelty, not to punish him, but because I needed that pause. That breath, that second to remind myself that calm was my strength now, not reaction. I smoothed my sweater, checked my reflection in the hallway mirror, noticing how composed I looked compared to how shaken I felt inside. Ha ha ha. Funny how life does that, and only then did I turn the lock. He burst in like the air had been sucked out of his lungs, eyes wide, face flushed, words tumbling over each other before he could catch them. You can't do this, he said, pacing. Running a hand through his hair. You can't just send a message like that. You said we have to leave. You said 30 days. And I watched him, really watched him. The man I raised reduced to panic because for the first time, something in his life wasn't bending to him. I walked past him calmly into the kitchen, put the kettle on like nothing extraordinary was happening, my hands steady, my movements slow, and asked almost gently, "Would you like some tea?" He stared at me like I had spoken another language. "This isn't funny," he said, his voice rising. "That's our home. We've lived there for years. You can't just take it away." I turned to face him then, leaned against the counter, and for a long moment said nothing, letting the silence stretch, because silence can be heavier than shouting. And when I finally spoke, my voice surprised even me, calm, clear, not angry. "Our home," I repeated softly. "Is that what you think?" He stopped pacing, looked at me properly for the first time, and something in his expression faltered, confusion slipping in under the panic. "Mom, please," he said, lower now. "We didn't mean it like that, the text. It was a mistake," and I sighed, a long one, the kind that carries years with it. "Was it a mistake?" I asked, "or was it just honest?" He opened his mouth, closed it, looked away. And in that small movement, I saw the truth he wasn't ready to say out loud. "We can't afford to move right now," he finally admitted, his voice breaking. "She quit her job, rent is expensive, we thought." "You thought what?" I asked quietly. "That I would accept being told not to come to my own house for Christmas." The words hung in the air, heavy, undeniable, and I watched realization spread across his face slowly, painfully. Like someone waking up too late from a dream. "You should have thought about all of this before sending that message." I continued, not harshly, just honestly, "before letting someone decide I no longer belonged." His shoulders sagged then, the anger draining out of him, replaced by something smaller. "Evicting us is extreme," he whispered, and I almost laughed, not out loud, just a breath of disbelief. "Extreme," I repeated. "Is being erased from your child's life while paying for the roof over his head." He looked up at me then, eyes wet. "I love you, Mom." And that was the hardest part, because love spoken without action is a hollow thing. "Then why?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my effort. Why didn't you stand up for me, even once? He had no answer, none that mattered. The truth sat between us, unspoken, fear, avoidance, choosing the path of least resistance. And I realized something painful but freeing in that moment. My son hadn't stopped loving me. He had just learned that sacrificing me was easier than facing conflict, and that realization hurt. But it also cleared something inside me. You need to leave now, I said quietly, and his head snapped up. Mom, 30 days, I repeated steady. That's the law and that's what you have. He stood there for a moment longer. Like he wanted to argue, beg, rewind time. But then he nodded slowly, defeated, and left without another word, the door closing behind him with a finality that echoed through the house. And when the silence returned, I finally felt my legs give a little. I sat down at the table, hands shaking now that the moment had passed, my heart pounding like it wanted to escape my chest. What had I done? I had just evicted my own child. The boy I raised alone, the one I rocked to sleep, the one whose future I had tried to protect at all costs. Tears came then, real ones, hot and unstoppable, because strength doesn't mean you don't feel pain. It means you don't let pain decide for you. And as I sat there, crying and breathing and reminding myself why this had to happen, another thought settled in, quiet but certain. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. Because now that I had said no, now that I had stepped out of the role they had assigned me, I knew there would be consequences, resistance, manipulation, attempts to pull me back into silence. And I wasn't naive enough to believe this would be easy, but I was finally done pretending that love meant surrender. And as the kettle clicked off behind me, steam rising like a sigh, I wiped my face, stood up, and began preparing for what I knew was coming next. Because when you take your power back, the first knock is only the warning, not the storm. That night after he left, after the door closed and the quiet settled back into the house, I sat there for a long time just listening to my own breathing, the kind that comes in short bursts after you've held yourself together for too long. Sigh. And once the shaking eased, something else took its place, not anger, not fear, but resolve, the calm kind that arrives when you finally accept that pretending is over, because now there was no space left for denial. No room for hoping things would magically fix themselves. This was real, and it required clarity, not emotion. So I stood up, wiped my face, and did something I hadn't done in years. I opened the old filing cabinet in the corner of my study, the one I rarely touched because it held memories as much as paperwork, and I began pulling things out, one folder at a time: deeds, mortgage papers, bank statements, receipts. My name printed neatly on every page, page after page after page, and as I laid them out on the table, the truth stared back at me in black and white. The house was mine, legally, fully, without confusion or shared ownership. My money, my signature, my responsibility, and yet somehow over time I had let myself forget that. I had allowed others to speak about it as if it were theirs, had let words reshape reality, awe, and sitting there under the warm kitchen light. I felt a mix of sadness and disbelief. Sadness that it had come to this, disbelief that it was ever unclear in the first place. I thought about how often I had corrected myself when calling it my house. Switching to your place so I wouldn't seem controlling, how often I had stepped back so they could step forward, and now here I was, finally reclaiming not just a property, but my voice. I opened my laptop next, fingers moving carefully as I searched, reading about tenant laws, eviction notices, legal rights, taking notes like a student again, reminding myself that knowledge is power, that calm preparation beats emotional reaction every time. And as I read, I realized something else that made my stomach tighten. They hadn't just been living there, they had been changing things, renovating, altering, making decisions without ever asking me. And suddenly, small comments came back to me, walls being opened up, bathrooms redone, modern touches added, things I had nodded along to without thinking too deeply, because I trusted them, because I didn't want to interfere. Because I believed respect flowed both ways, but trust without oversight can turn into damage, literal damage, and that thought wouldn't let go. So the next morning, after barely sleeping, I did what any careful person would do. I called a professional, someone to inspect the house properly, not out of spite, but out of responsibility, because if something had gone wrong, it was my name on the line, my future at risk. When he arrived a couple of days later, I walked through the house slowly, memories clinging to every room, and what he pointed out made my chest feel tight. Walls removed without permits, plumbing redone incorrectly, water damage hidden behind pretty tiles. Issues that weren't cosmetic but structural, expensive, dangerous. And as he spoke calmly about repairs and violations, all I could think was, they didn't just push me out, they put everything I worked for at risk. And that realization hurt more than the rejection ever had, because it wasn't just emotional now. It was tangible, measurable, serious. When I sat in my car afterward, report in hand, I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I just stared ahead, feeling something settle deep inside me. This wasn't about being welcome or not. This was about accountability. about someone benefiting from my silence while quietly tearing apart what I had built, and that's when the phone rang. Her name flashing on the screen, I hesitated, then answered, and her voice was sharp, defensive, angry, accusing me of invading their privacy, of trying to make them homeless, of being cruel right before Christmas, and I listened quietly, letting her words spill out because when people feel cornered, they reveal more than they intend. When she finally paused, I spoke calmly, "It's my house," and the silence that followed was loud. She laughed bitterly, accused me of caring more about property than family, warned me that my son would never forgive me, that I would end up alone, and for a moment, just a moment, those words stung, because fear doesn't disappear overnight. But then I remembered the documents on my table, the damage report in my hand, the months of disrespect I had swallowed, and I realized something important. This wasn't cruelty, it was boundaries. And boundaries always feel harsh to the people who benefited from you having none. I ended the call without raising my voice, hands trembling slightly afterward, but heart steady, because for the first time I wasn't reacting to threats. I was responding to reality. That night I barely slept again, thoughts circling, doubts whispering, but beneath it all was a certainty I hadn't felt in years. I was doing the right thing, even if it hurt, even if it scared me, even if it changed everything. And if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting yourself, you know how heavy that choice feels, but you also know the relief that comes once it's made. And as morning light filled the room, I knew the next step was unavoidable. This was no longer a private family matter, it was a legal one. And once that door opened, there would be no turning back because the truth about that house had surfaced. And now it demanded to be acknowledged, whether they were ready for it or not. I thought once the truth was out, once the papers were filed and the boundaries were clear, things would quiet down, but I was wrong, because when people realize they can no longer control you gently, they try to control you loudly, sigh. And that's exactly what happened next. It started with messages, one after another, my phone lighting up with guilt dressed as concern, anger pretending to be reason, promises mixed with threats, and I let them sit there unread for hours. Not because I was trying to be cruel, but because I needed distance to think clearly, because reacting too fast had cost me too much already. Then the calls began, unknown numbers, familiar numbers. Voices I didn't recognize leaving voicemails full of judgment, accusing me of being heartless, of tearing a family apart, and for a moment, I wondered how quickly a story can travel once it's shaped by someone else. How easily you become the villain when you stop playing your assigned role. And then came the confrontation I had been expecting, the one I knew would arrive once calm manipulation failed. They showed up together, unannounced. Standing on my doorstep like a united front, her eyes sharp, his face tense, and before I could even speak, she pushed past me into my home, talking loudly about betrayal, about greed, about how I cared more about money than my own child. Her words filling the room, heavy and aggressive, meant to overwhelm me, meant to push me back into silence. But something inside me had changed. I didn't raise my voice, didn't argue point by point. I simply stated facts, that the house was mine, that changes had been made without permission, that damage had been found, and every calm sentence seemed to make her angrier. Because calm doesn't give manipulators anything to grab onto. She accused me of ruining their lives, of destroying their marriage, of humiliating them right before the holidays. And I listened, really listened, not to the words, but to what was underneath them: entitlement, fear, desperation, the realization that control was slipping. When she threatened to tell everyone, to post online, to paint me as a cruel mother who made her son homeless. My heart skipped for a moment, because public shame is powerful, and part of me still cared what people thought. But then I remembered all the years I had stayed quiet to protect an image that didn't protect me back. And I said something I never thought I would: the truth tells itself. And in that moment, her confidence cracked just slightly, because lies only work when the other person is afraid to stand still. My son tried to mediate, voice shaking, asking us to talk calmly, to find compromise, but compromise only works when both sides respect each other. And respect had left this situation a long time ago. I told him gently that I had tried for months, that I had swallowed discomfort for the sake of peace, and that peace had cost me my place in his life. And as I spoke, I saw something in his eyes, confusion mixed with shame. The slow realization that the version of events he had accepted so easily might not be complete. She sensed it too, because her tone shifted then, suddenly soft, tearful, apologetic, talking about misunderstandings, about stress, about how hard things had been, and if this had happened a year earlier, I might have believed her, I might have folded, but now I recognized the pattern, the switch from attack to victim, the tears appearing exactly when resistance failed. And that's when I understood something important. None of this was about repairing relationships. It was about regaining control. When I told her calmly that the decision stood, that the process would continue, her mask dropped completely. The insults returned sharper, crueler, words meant to wound, to scare, to punish me for not backing down. And I won't lie, they hurt. Hearing someone tell you you'll die alone, that your own child will abandon you forever. Those words find old fears and press on them, but fear only works when you believe it more than yourself. And I didn't anymore. They left in anger, slamming doors, shouting threats that echoed long after the house went quiet again. And when I was alone, I finally allowed myself to feel it all: the shaking, the exhaustion, the grief, because strength isn't the absence of emotion, it's allowing emotion without letting it control your decisions. I spent the next few days mostly alone, tending my garden, touching the earth, grounding myself in something real and steady, letting my nervous system settle, and in that quiet, something else became clear. This situation wasn't just messy, it was calculated. Too many things didn't add up: the urgency, the financial pressure, the way she had isolated him so effectively, the renovations done without thought for cost or permission. And that realization made me uneasy, because conflict driven by desperation is unpredictable. And if I wanted to protect myself fully, I needed more than courage, I needed information. So when my lawyer suggested taking a deeper look, hiring someone to uncover what I couldn't see, I didn't hesitate the way I once would have, because I had learned the hard way that ignoring warning signs doesn't make them disappear. And as I agreed to move forward, heart steady but alert, I knew the next truth waiting to surface would change everything, not just how I saw her, but how my son would finally see the reality he had been living in, whether he was ready for it or not. The call came earlier than I expected, my phone buzzing on the table while I was folding laundry, the ordinary rhythm of life clashing with the seriousness in the voice on the other end, and the moment I heard it, my stomach tightened sigh. Because some news announces itself before words ever do, she told me we needed to meet in person, that what she had found shouldn't be discussed over the phone, and those few sentences were enough to send my thoughts racing. I drove there with my hands tight on the wheel, trying to prepare myself, telling myself not to jump to conclusions. But deep down, I already knew this was bigger than hurt feelings or family drama. When she laid everything out in front of me, piece by piece, it felt like watching a puzzle finally come together in a way that made sense and terrified me at the same time. There were gaps in her story, lies she had told casually, jobs that hadn't ended the way she claimed, debts hidden behind confident smiles, patterns of behavior that weren't accidents but habits. And as I listened, I felt a strange mix of shock and relief: shock at how far things had gone, relief that I hadn't imagined the manipulation, that the unease I felt for so long had been real, grounded, justified. All because there's a special kind of pain in realizing your instincts were right, but you ignored them out of love. I left that meeting with a folder heavier than it looked, not just with documents, but with truth. And I knew then that I couldn't keep this to myself, not if I wanted my son to have a chance at seeing clearly. That evening I invited him over, just him, no explanations beyond "we need to talk." And when he arrived, he looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of the past weeks had finally settled on him too. We sat at the table where he used to do homework, where I once corrected spelling and kissed scraped knees. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence thick with everything unsaid. Then I slid the folder across to him, my hand steady even though my heart wasn't, and told him gently to read, to take his time, to not look at me until he was finished. He resisted at first, defensive, uncomfortable, saying this wasn't necessary, that I was going too far, but eventually he opened it, and I watched his face change as page after page rewrote the story he had believed. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something like dread, his breathing shallow, his fingers gripping the paper a little too tightly. "This can't be true," he whispered, and I wanted so badly to protect him from that moment, to take the knowledge back, but truth doesn't work that way. I wish it wasn't, I said quietly, and we sat there while the weight of it sank in. He asked questions, desperate ones, trying to find explanations that would soften what he was seeing, but there were none that didn't involve admitting he had been lied to, manipulated, guided away from his own mother, one small step at a time. Tears came then, not dramatic, just steady, silent, the kind that fall when your world tilts and doesn't stop. He left shortly after, saying he needed to talk to her, to hear it from her directly, and when the door closed behind him, I felt fear twist in my chest, because confronting a manipulator doesn't always bring clarity, sometimes it brings chaos. I didn't sleep that night, my mind replaying every possibility, every outcome, every way this could end badly. And the next morning, my phone exploded with messages and missed calls, his name over and over again, hers too. And when he finally came back, hours later, his face told me everything before he spoke. Something had broken, irrevocably. He told me she denied everything at first, then shifted stories, then lashed out, then cried, then blamed me. The full cycle, and hearing it laid out so plainly was like hearing an echo of everything I had already lived through, except this time, he saw it too, really saw it, not filtered through loyalty or fear, but clearly, painfully. He said words I never thought I'd hear. I didn't recognize myself anymore. And those words cut deep, because that was exactly what I had been mourning all along, the son I knew slipping away into someone else's narrative. We sat together for a long time after that, not fixing anything, not planning next steps, just existing in the truth of it, because once illusions fall, there's a grief that follows even when you're relieved, and as heavy as that moment was. Something else was there too, something fragile but real: honesty, the kind that rebuilds slowly if you let it. I told him I wasn't asking him to choose sides, only to see clearly, to stop sacrificing his own judgment to keep someone else calm, and he nodded, exhausted but resolute in a way I hadn't seen in years. When he left that day, it felt different, not resolved, not healed, but honest. And honesty is the beginning of every real ending and every real beginning. I didn't know yet how things would unfold legally, emotionally, practically, but I knew one thing had changed forever: the truth was no longer mine alone. And once truth enters a room, nothing can go back to how it was before, not relationships, not stories, not power. And as I stood there watching the light fade outside my window, I realized the hardest part wasn't standing up for myself anymore. It was waiting to see what my son would do now that he finally knew who he had been living with, and whether facing the truth would make him stronger or tear everything apart completely. The ending didn't arrive with fireworks or applause, it came quietly, the way real change often does, sigh one decision followed by another, each a little steadier than the last. My son moved out within weeks, not angrily, not dramatically, just with a kind of sad determination, like someone finally waking up from a long, exhausting dream. He packed what was his, left the rest behind, and when he handed me the keys, his hands were shaking. "I should have listened to you," he said. Voice low, and I didn't say, "I told you so." I didn't say anything clever or sharp, I just hugged him, because sometimes consequences teach better than words ever could. The house felt empty after that, too big, too quiet, carrying scars in its walls that reminded me of everything that had been ignored for too long. Repairs were expensive, exhausting, but manageable, and eventually I made the decision to let it go, not out of defeat, but out of closure. Selling it felt like releasing a chapter that had already taught me everything it could, and when the papers were signed and the door closed for the last time, I felt lighter than I had in years, not because I won, but because I was free. My son started coming by again, slowly at first, Sunday dinners like we used to have, awkward conversations mixed with laughter, ha ha ha. Healing isn't instant, it stumbles, but it grows. He apologized more than once. Not just for the message, but for the silence, for the way he let someone else rewrite his values. And I forgave him, not because it didn't hurt, but because holding on to pain doesn't protect you, it just weighs you down. Life after all of this surprised me. I traveled, I gardened, I made friends who saw me fully, not as a role, but as a person. And for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was shrinking to keep peace. I felt like I was expanding into myself. My son grew too, learning boundaries the hard way, choosing honesty over comfort, and watching him become himself again was worth every difficult moment that came before. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how far things went, if I wish I had just stayed quiet and kept the family together, and I always pause before answering, because regret is complicated, but the truth is this: staying silent would have cost me myself, and no relationship is worth that price. Love should never require erasing who you are. And if there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that standing up for yourself isn't cruel, it's necessary. Boundaries aren't punishment, they're protection, and respect isn't something you beg for, it's something you allow or deny. If you've listened this far and felt something stir inside you, if this story reminded you of your own quiet sacrifices or unspoken pain, subscribe for more stories like this, because you're not alone. And remember this: teaching people how to treat you may be the hardest lesson you ever learn, but it's also the one that gives you your life back.